She realized something was wrong before anyone spoke, because the silence had weight, and it pressed against her the moment she crossed the threshold of the Valewyn estate, settling on her shoulders like a verdict already delivered. Maribel Thorne did not miss details. She had been raised to read rooms the way others read ledgers, and this one announced itself in the smallest betrayals. The pause before a servant accepted her cloak, the way conversation softened rather than ceased, the careful avoidance of her eyes by those who had written to her so warmly only weeks before. Her long hair had been arranged with deliberate precision, dark and gleaming down her back, every pin placed as if composure itself might be measured and found wanting, and she carried herself accordingly, spine straight, expression serene, refusing to grant the room even the hint of uncertainty. Yet beneath that control, something tightened. She had been invited. She had been summoned. She had been assured this gathering was familial, consultative, gentle in its intentions, but already she sensed that gentleness had been extended only to those who held power. The drawing-room doors were open, the fire was lit, chairs were placed in careful arcs that suggested conversation rather than confrontation, and still there was a space that did not include her, a circle formed without invitation, voices lowered as if she were a presence to be managed rather than a woman to be addressed. When she was finally guided forward, it was not with ceremony but with efficiency, as though the house wished to conclude a task rather than welcome a guest, and it was then, before any declaration, before any explanation, that she saw the letter resting on the table. It bore her name, written in a hand she recognized, and it had already been opened. The knowledge struck cleanly and without mercy. Her fate had been discussed, decided, and arranged in her absence, and whatever remained was performance. She listened as pleasantries were exchanged, as concern was expressed for her comfort, as assurances were offered that everything had been handled with her best interests in mind, and she understood, with a clarity that chilled rather than panicked her, that no one intended to ask what she wanted. This was how decisions were made here, quietly, politely, with the illusion of benevolence masking the removal of choice, and if she protested too sharply, she would be cast not as wronged but as ungrateful. So she did what she had learned to do since girlhood, when rooms closed ranks against her. She observed. She noted the confidence with which her future was referenced, the ease with which her consent was assumed, the faint satisfaction in certain glances that suggested this arrangement solved more than one inconvenient problem. Fear stirred, but it did not rule her. Instead, a colder understanding took shape. Silence, she realized, was not neutral in this house. It was the instrument by which lives were shaped, bent, and claimed, and if she allowed it to claim hers, no outcry later would be believed. She lifted her chin, folded her gloved hands with exactness, and waited, knowing that whatever was about to be spoken aloud would only confirm what had already been decided in silence, and that from this moment forward, she would have to choose whether to endure it or find the courage to break it. They did not announce the decision all at once, as if bluntness might betray the violence of it, but let it unfold through implication and softened language, through remarks about continuity and stewardship, and the importance of securing what had always belonged to House of Valewyn, and Maribel understood, with a tightening behind her ribs, that she was being positioned as solution rather than participant. She stood where she had been guided, just beyond the circle of upholstered chairs, long hair still perfectly arranged down her back, every line of her posture communicating composure, even as her pulse made itself known in her ears, and she listened while names were mentioned, lands referenced, and futures outlined with the confidence of people accustomed to being obeyed. Someone spoke of duty as though it were a kindness, another of protection as though it were a gift bestowed rather than a leash fastened, and when the intended groom was finally introduced, his absence remedied with the promise of an imminent arrival, Maribel felt the last of her uncertainty give way to something colder and more exact. No one asked if she wished to marry. They spoke instead of when, of how well it would be received, of how fortunate she was to be considered so valuable to the preservation of legacy, and the unspoken truth threaded through every sentence was that refusal had not been accounted for. She answered when addressed, her voice steady, polite, controlled, offering thanks where thanks were expected, nodding when nods were demanded, and each response was measured not by sincerity but by survival, because she understood instinctively that any visible resistance would be catalogued, shared, and used. The room itself seemed complicit, walls heavy with portraits of ancestors whose gazes suggested approval rather than mercy, and the fire crackled as if in punctuation to claims that were not theirs to make. When a document was referenced, not yet produced, but described as a mere formality, Maribel's attention sharpened, and she marked the way certain members of the family exchanged glances, satisfied, already rehearsing the conclusion. She thought of her own family then, of letters written with careful optimism, of assurances given without full knowledge, and the awareness that she had been delivered into this moment without defense settled heavily but did not bend her. Fear brushed her consciousness, sharp and real, but she refused its command, choosing instead to watch, to remember, to gather every word and gesture that revealed how this house operated when it believed itself unchallenged. It was only when Duke Nathaniel Blackmere entered the room, his arrival unannounced but immediately acknowledged, that the balance shifted in ways too subtle for triumph, yet too significant to ignore. He took his place among them with composed ease, dark gaze sweeping the gathering before resting briefly, deliberately, on Maribel, and in that moment of recognition she felt something alter, not in circumstance but in possibility. He said nothing at first, offering the expected courtesies, acknowledging the purpose of the gathering with diplomatic restraint, and still his presence changed the texture of the air, introducing witness where there had been only assumption. Maribel did not allow herself hope. Hope was dangerous in rooms like this, but she registered the way Nathaniel's attention lingered, assessing not her suitability, but the mechanics of her entrapment, and she understood that while her fate had been spoken of without her consent, it had not yet been sealed. Silence, she knew now, was no longer the only force at work. Duke Nathaniel Blackmere listened as others spoke, his stillness so complete it suggested indifference, though nothing about him was inattentive, and Maribel sensed, without knowing how, that his silence differed from theirs. He stood slightly apart from the Valewyn circle, not excluded, but unentangled. His posture relaxed in the way of a man accustomed to rooms yielding without effort, and as the conversation resumed around land and legacy, his gaze moved with deliberate slowness, taking in the arrangement of bodies, the direction of glances, the subtle choreography of power that required no raised voice to enforce obedience. When his attention returned to Maribel, it was not lingering in the manner of appraisal she had learned to endure, but steady, assessing the imbalance itself rather than its supposed prize, and she felt the faintest tightening in her chest as she recognized the difference. He had been invited, she realized, not merely as witness, but as endorsement. His presence lent gravity to decisions already shaped. His title, a silent seal meant to discourage dissent. The Valewyn spoke more confidently with him present, as though assured that no one of consequence would object, and Nathaniel understood precisely what role he was expected to play. Emotion flickered beneath his restraint, something like distaste, sharpened by recognition, as he traced the ease with which Maribel's future was discussed as a logistical necessity rather than a human choice, and though he offered no interruption, the shift within him was unmistakable. He had grown up among bloodlines that prized continuity over conscience, had learned early how tradition could be wielded to excuse cruelty, and seeing it enacted so cleanly before him stirred an old, unwelcome anger he had long disciplined into silence. Maribel felt his scrutiny not as pressure but as acknowledgement, a rare thing in a room that preferred her compliant and quiet, and she held his gaze for a fraction longer than politeness required, neither pleading nor retreating, simply present. In that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, recognition without promise, understanding without declaration. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement so small it could be mistaken for courtesy, yet Maribel registered it as something else entirely, a signal that she had been seen as more than circumstance. Conversation moved on, as conversations did, and the Valewyn elders spoke of schedules and announcements, of the ease with which matters would conclude once formalities were observed, but Nathaniel's attention had sharpened, no longer diffused among the room but fixed on the mechanisms at work. He asked a single question, framed carefully, about the timing of certain documents, and the response came too quickly, too rehearsed, confirming what he had already suspected. This arrangement had been in motion long before Maribel's arrival. Her presence required only to legitimize what had already been secured. The realization settled heavily but did not surprise him. He had been raised to understand power, and power, he knew, despised uncertainty. Silence was its favored instrument. As the gathering dispersed toward dinner, Nathaniel remained momentarily still, watching Maribel move with controlled grace through a space that sought to contain her, and something resolved quietly within him. He did not yet know what form resistance would take, nor how costly it might become, But he understood with sudden clarity that to remain merely present was to be complicit, and that whatever unfolded next would demand more of him than polite observation. Dinner unfolded with the careful choreography of civility, courses served in measured succession, conversation calibrated to exclude discomfort while inflicting it all the same, and Maribel found herself seated where she could neither fully participate nor be accused of neglect, a placement that announced her position more clearly than words ever could. Her long hair had been gathered again with deliberate neatness, the familiar weight of it against her back, a reminder of discipline as she lifted her glass when others did, smiled when smiles were expected, and answered only when directly addressed, each response composed to reveal nothing that might be seized and reshaped against her. The table glittered with silver and crystal, yet the atmosphere carried a faint, suffocating chill, the kind that came not from cold but from unanimity, from the knowledge that everyone present understood the outcome and believed it settled. Conversation skimmed the surface of harmless topics, seasonal events, distant relations, charitable appearances, while beneath it ran a current of assumption so strong it required no reinforcement. When the intended groom's name surfaced again, spoken with familiarity rather than anticipation, Maribel felt the edges of her restraint sharpen, and she noted the way several glances flicked toward her, not to seek her reaction but to measure compliance. Duke Nathaniel Blackmere sat opposite, his demeanor unchanged, his engagement with the table precise and minimal, and though he spoke little, his presence altered the dynamic in ways subtle enough to frustrate those who relied on unchallenged consensus. He observed how Maribel was excluded from certain lines of conversation, how her future was referenced obliquely as though it were already shared property, and with each passing moment his controlled composure was tested by the ease with which her autonomy was erased. When a remark was made, lightly, almost humorously, about how fortunate arrangements tended to resolve themselves when all parties were sensible, Nathaniel felt the word sensible strike with particular force, and he met Maribel's gaze across the table, just as she lowered hers, her expression serene, her hands steady, her silence chosen but not surrendered. The exchange lasted only a breath, yet it carried weight, and in that brief alignment, he recognized the violence inherent in what was being enacted, the insistence that quiet acceptance equaled virtue, that resistance would be interpreted as deficiency rather than refusal. As the meal progressed, the Valewyn elders grew more assured, their voices warmer, their plans spoken with increasing openness, and Nathaniel understood that the absence of objection had emboldened them. He felt the pressure of expectation settle upon him, not spoken, but keenly present, to endorse, to normalize, to allow his title to sanctify what was being done, and the realization stirred a slow, unwelcome tension beneath his restraint. Maribel endured the remainder of the evening with unbroken composure, but Nathaniel saw the cost of that endurance in the careful economy of her movements, the way she conserved herself against a tide that would happily spend her. When dinner finally drew to a close and chairs were pushed back with polite murmurs of satisfaction, he knew with certainty that whatever came next would not allow him the comfort of distance, and that the silence he had maintained until now was fast becoming a choice rather than a habit. Maribel did not wait for permission when she rose from the table, excusing herself with a calm nod that invited no inquiry, and she followed the familiar corridors toward the terrace, as though drawn by habit rather than necessity, her steps measured, her breathing controlled, determined not to reveal how tightly the evening had coiled inside her. The doors opened onto cold night air and the scent of damp stone, and she welcomed the sharpness of it, allowing herself a single, silent breath before the weight of the house pressed back in. Beyond the balustrade, the grounds lay hushed beneath moonlight, paths pale and orderly, everything in its place, and the symmetry of it struck her as both beautiful and cruel. Here, too, nothing was meant to stray. She rested her gloved hands against the stone, long hair stirring faintly with the breeze, and allowed the composure she had maintained to loosen just enough to think clearly. Fear hovered, real and persistent, but it no longer screamed. It had sharpened into awareness. She understood now that whatever kindness had been offered to her had always been conditional, and that the silence expected of her was not protection but erasure. When footsteps sounded behind her, she did not startle, though she did not turn at once, recognizing the measured cadence before she heard his voice. Duke Nathaniel Blackmere joined her without intrusion, maintaining a careful distance that acknowledged her space, and for a moment, neither spoke, the quiet between them distinct from the suffocating hush inside the house. It was he who broke it, his tone low and precise, not offering comfort, but confirmation. He told her, without embellishment, that House of Valewyn rarely reversed decisions once they had been spoken among themselves, and that whatever had been arranged would be pursued with relentless politeness until concluded. Maribel listened, her gaze fixed on the gardens below, absorbing the truth without flinching, and when she replied, her voice was steady, free of plea or panic. She thanked him for his honesty, acknowledging what she had already begun to suspect, and in doing so established the terms of their exchange: clarity over consolation, truth over reassurance. Nathaniel watched her carefully as she spoke, noting the discipline that held her together, the quiet intelligence with which she assessed rather than reacted, and something within him shifted, subtle but decisive. This was not a woman awaiting rescue, but one weighing options in a narrowing field, and the recognition altered the nature of his concern. He told her then that silence was the house's most effective instrument, and that once she accepted its terms, reclaiming her voice would become infinitely harder. The words were not a warning so much as an invitation to awareness, and Maribel received them as such, meeting his gaze at last, her expression composed but intent. In that moment, alliance took its first, fragile shape, not sealed by promise or sentiment, but by mutual refusal to pretend that what was happening was inevitable. When they returned inside, they did so separately, as propriety demanded. But the quiet that followed Maribel no longer felt imposed. For the first time since her arrival, silence had become a space in which choice might still exist. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light slipping through tall windows, as though the house itself wished to pretend nothing had shifted overnight, and Maribel rose early, long hair unbound for the first time since her arrival, letting it fall freely down her back as she dressed with deliberate calm, choosing simplicity over ornament as a quiet act of defiance she did not yet name. The corridors were still when she stepped into them, servants moving with hushed efficiency, eyes lowered, and she sensed in their careful distance the same unspoken awareness that had greeted her the evening before. Whatever was unfolding concerned her, but was not meant to include her voice. She took breakfast alone, the formality of the room emphasizing her isolation, and used the solitude to think, not of escape, but of leverage, of what could still be shaped if she refused to be hurried into consent. When Duke Nathaniel Blackmere sought her out later, it was without ceremony or urgency, his manner unchanged, respectful in its restraint, and they spoke where they could be overheard without being intruded upon, every word chosen with awareness. He did not soften the reality he laid before her, nor did he dramatize it. He explained instead how House of Valewyn operated when faced with hesitation, how delay would be tolerated only if it served their interests, and how silence would be interpreted as eventual compliance. Maribel listened, absorbing the structure of power being outlined, and felt something settle within her, not resignation but clarity. She responded with questions rather than objections, probing the edges of what he described, testing where assumption ended and certainty began, and Nathaniel found himself answering not as an advisor dispensing instruction, but as an equal engaged in strategy. The shift was subtle, yet unmistakable, and it altered the tone of their exchange, drawing them into alignment, not through emotion but through shared intent. Maribel acknowledged the danger plainly, stating that she would not mistake patience for safety, nor politeness for mercy, and Nathaniel, in turn, recognized the discipline it took to speak so calmly, while standing on the brink of dispossession. When they parted, there was no agreement reached, no plan set in motion, only the understanding that silence between them would no longer be accidental. As Maribel watched him walk away, she felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar, not hope, which she distrusted, but the steadier knowledge that awareness, once gained, could not be taken from her, and that whatever House of Valewyn intended to do next, it would no longer unfold entirely beyond her sight. The man chosen for her arrived before noon, announced with a familiarity that assumed her interest and consent alike, and Maribel understood at once that this introduction was meant not to invite judgment, but to finalize it. He was presented as amiable, well-positioned, and suitably grateful for the opportunity being extended, his manners polished, his smile practiced, and as he bowed over her hand with proprietary ease rather than courtesy, she felt the last fragile illusion of misunderstanding fall away. He spoke of the future as though it had already been agreed upon, referencing shared responsibilities and anticipated arrangements with an ease that suggested rehearsal, and each word confirmed what the Valewins had not needed to say aloud. Her role had been decided, and all that remained was her acquiescence. Maribel responded with composed politeness, answering where she must, withholding where she could, her long hair framing her face in a way that concealed nothing of her expression yet revealed no weakness, and as she listened, she measured not the man himself, but the certainty with which he believed himself entitled. Across the room, Duke Nathaniel Blackmere observed without intrusion, his restraint drawn taut by the ease with which the groom spoke of possession disguised as partnership, and something hardened quietly within him. This was not negotiation. It was entitlement granted institutional cover, and the clarity of it stripped away any lingering doubt about the nature of the threat Maribel faced. When the conversation ended, the groom departing with assurances that would have sounded generous to anyone not trapped within them, Maribel remained still, her composure intact, yet her understanding irrevocably altered. The horror she felt was not dramatic, but precise, sharpened by recognition that this marriage would not merely bind her, but erase her, and that compliance would be framed as virtue, while resistance would be punished as ingratitude. Nathaniel did not approach her immediately, respecting the distance she maintained, but when their gazes met briefly, there was no question left unasked between them. What she faced was not inconvenience, nor discomfort, but the systematic removal of choice, and in that knowledge, her endurance began to change shape, hardening into resistance that no longer waited for permission to exist. Nathaniel was summoned shortly after, the request delivered with the same polished courtesy that masked urgency, and he followed the footman through corridors that seemed to narrow rather than open, their walls heavy with the portraits of Valewyn ancestors whose painted eyes watched with untroubled confidence. Lord Valewyn received him in a smaller study, set apart from the main rooms, a space designed for discretion rather than comfort, and spoke without preamble, as men did when they believed authority already secured compliance. The engagement, he explained, was not merely advantageous but necessary, a solution to questions of land and legitimacy that had lingered too long, and Maribel Thorne, by virtue of timing and circumstance, had been found suitable to resolve them. He spoke of guardianship, of debts absorbed and obligations balanced, of how easily disorder could be corrected when all parties understood their place, and as Nathaniel listened, his restraint tightened into something colder, more deliberate. This was not tradition upheld out of reverence, but leverage applied with practiced ease, and the casual way Lord Valewyn referenced Maribel's lack of alternatives stripped the exchange of any remaining civility. Nathaniel asked measured questions, his tone neutral, his expression unreadable, probing the edges of legality rather than morality, and the answers came too readily, revealing a confidence born of repetition. When the meeting concluded, Nathaniel left with the quiet certainty that Maribel's fate had been engineered long before she was invited to witness it, and that the house relied not on righteousness, but on silence enforced through fear of ruin. As he stepped back into the light-filled corridor, the awareness settled fully. Whatever alliance had once bound him to House of Valewyn was already fractured, because he could no longer pretend ignorance of the cost their certainty demanded. The warning came not from the family but from below stairs, delivered in a whisper meant to protect both speaker and listener, and Maribel recognized the courage it took the moment it was offered. The maid who approached her did so under the pretense of attending to a ribbon, her eyes lowered, her hands steady despite the tremor beneath them, and in the soft cadence of habitual discretion, she told Maribel what the house would never state outright. Refusals here did not remain refusals. They were recast as indiscretions, misunderstandings, lapses in judgment that society was all too eager to punish. Women who resisted did not simply decline, they were unmade. The words landed without flourish, precise and devastating, and Maribel felt fear sharpen into something far more useful than panic. She thanked the maid quietly, acknowledging not just the information but the risk in giving it, and when she was left alone again, she stood very still, long hair falling in an unstudied line down her back, and allowed herself a single moment of clear-eyed assessment. This was not merely a matter of endurance, nor even of courage. It was a calculation of cost, of how much she was willing to lose in order to keep herself intact. The realization did not break her. Instead, it steadied her, anchoring resolve where uncertainty had lived, and when she moved again, it was with purpose sharpened by understanding. Silence, she saw now, was not the absence of resistance, but its most dangerous form, and if she allowed herself to be quiet in the way they demanded, the story told of her would no longer belong to her at all. Nathaniel approached her later that afternoon with neither urgency nor secrecy, choosing instead the wide corridor near the windows where conversation could not be easily twisted into conspiracy, and Maribel recognized the care in that choice at once. He spoke to her plainly, his voice low but steady, laying out a possibility rather than a command: delay. Not refusal yet, not flight, but postponement forced into the open, a disruption of the certainty House of Valewyn relied upon to close ranks and proceed without challenge. He explained how public hesitation unsettled private schemes, how questions introduced before witnesses demanded answers rather than threats, and how time, when seized deliberately, could become leverage instead of trap. Maribel listened without interruption, her expression composed, long hair catching the afternoon light as she turned his words over with the same discipline she had applied to every choice since arriving. Her instinctive resistance rose quickly, not to the strategy itself, but to the implication of dependence, and she met his gaze directly as she answered, making clear that she would not exchange one form of control for another, however well-intentioned. Nathaniel did not argue. He acknowledged her concern, clarifying that cooperation did not require surrender, only alignment, and that any step taken would remain hers to accept or reject. The exchange altered something fundamental between them, shifting their connection from tentative understanding to deliberate alliance, and Maribel felt it as a tightening of purpose rather than a softening of resolve. She agreed to consider the delay, not because she trusted the house to honor it, but because she recognized the power in choosing when to speak and when to remain still. As they parted, the air between them carried a new weight, not expectation, but commitment to clarity, and Maribel understood that whatever came next would no longer unfold entirely beyond her influence. The morning ride was suggested as though it were a courtesy, an indulgence granted to restore spirits, and Maribel accepted with measured gratitude, understanding that even generosity within House of Valewyn was rarely without purpose. The air beyond the estate was cool and pale, mist clinging low to the fields as though the land itself had not yet decided what it wished to reveal, and she welcomed the quiet of it, the absence of walls and listening ears. Her long hair was left unbound, falling freely down her back, the weight of it unfamiliar after days of careful restraint, and the sensation stirred something subtle within her, not freedom, not yet, but the memory of it. Duke Nathaniel Blackmere rode beside her at a distance that respected propriety without suggesting avoidance, his posture relaxed, his attention attentive without being intrusive, and for a time neither spoke, allowing the rhythm of hooves and the steady breath of horses to create a silence unlike any she had known since arriving. This quiet did not press or demand, it simply existed, open and unclaimed. As the estate receded behind them, Maribel felt the tension she carried ease slightly, enough to think more clearly, and she found herself observing Nathaniel not as a potential ally alone, but as a man navigating restraint, with intention rather than habit. He spoke eventually, not of strategy or danger, but of the land, of how places remembered the choices made upon them long after names faded, and the comment struck her with unexpected force, resonating with the knowledge that her own life was being shaped by decisions made without her voice. When she replied, it was thoughtfully, acknowledging the truth in his words, and the exchange felt equal in a way few conversations ever had. Emotionally, the moment marked a quiet turning point for her. She allowed herself to be seen not as composed surface alone, but as a woman capable of reflection and depth, and Nathaniel responded not with admiration, but with respect. They rode on, side by side now, and Maribel became aware of how easily endurance had defined her for so long, how instinctively she had learned to conserve herself rather than claim space. The realization did not come with regret, but with resolve, a recognition that survival had been necessary, but it need not remain sufficient. Nathaniel watched her with careful perception, noting the change in her bearing as the land opened before them, and understood that the house had underestimated her, not because she was weak, but because she was quiet. The awareness sharpened his own purpose. When they turned back toward the estate, the mist lifting slowly around them, neither spoke of what awaited, yet both carried the knowledge that this fragile interval of peace had clarified rather than softened their intent. As the walls of Valewyn rose again into view, Maribel gathered her composure without binding it too tightly, her long hair still loose against her back, and felt, for the first time since her arrival, that she was not merely enduring the days ahead, but preparing herself to meet them on her own terms. The change in atmosphere was subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone not already attuned to it, but Maribel felt it the moment she returned to the house, as though the walls themselves had adjusted their attention, no longer merely containing her but watching her. Servants who had once passed with practiced neutrality now lingered half a beat longer than necessary, eyes flicking up and away, conversations pausing and resuming with careful timing, and she understood that the morning's brief freedom had not gone unnoticed. Her long hair was braided back again, disciplined into order as she moved through the corridors, yet the composure she wore felt different now, less armor than intention, and she carried it with a steadiness that came not from habit but from choice. House of Valewyn had begun to observe rather than assume, and observation, she knew, often preceded correction. Nathaniel felt it as well. When he encountered Lord Valewyn later that day, the courtesy extended to him was warmer than before, edged with inquiry rather than trust, and questions were framed as conversation rather than interrogation. Loyalty was being tested, quietly, the way men of power preferred, and Nathaniel answered with careful precision, offering nothing that could be seized and reshaped into accusation. Emotionally, the scrutiny clarified matters rather than unsettling him. The house had begun to sense resistance, and resistance, once suspected, was rarely forgiven. His restraint sharpened accordingly, no longer passive but deliberate, every gesture weighed for consequence. Maribel sensed the narrowing margins with acute awareness. Invitations were extended and withdrawn within the same breath, corridors redirected, opportunities for privacy reduced under the guise of protection, and she understood the message clearly enough: she was being managed. Fear brushed against her resolve, insistent but no longer dominant, and she forced herself to remain visible, present in common rooms, courteous in exchanges, refusing both provocation and retreat. The strategy was exhausting, but it was also empowering in its own quiet way, a refusal to be pushed into corners where narratives could be written without her. When she and Nathaniel crossed paths later, it was brief and public, a nod exchanged, a comment offered about the weather, yet beneath the surface ran careful coordination, an unspoken acknowledgement that every movement now carried weight. Emotionally, their alliance tightened, not through intimacy but through shared vigilance, each aware that the other's misstep could be exploited. The house was adjusting its tactics, trading assumption for surveillance, and in doing so revealed its vulnerability. Certainty had begun to fracture. That evening, as Maribel stood before her mirror, unfastening the pins from her hair one by one, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. The woman reflected there was composed, controlled, and unmistakably aware, no longer moving blindly through expectation. House of Valewyn might still believe it could bend her, but it had begun to watch because it sensed something had shifted, and Maribel understood with quiet clarity that awareness was power they could no longer take from her. The documents were presented as though they were an afterthought, introduced midway through the morning with practiced casualness, a neat stack placed upon a writing table already arranged for use, ink refreshed, chair drawn back in quiet invitation. Maribel recognized the trap at once, not because the papers themselves were threatening, but because of how carefully they were framed as inevitable, a procedural courtesy rather than a demand. Her long hair had been arranged simply that day, drawn back at the nape of her neck, and she felt the familiar instinct to still herself rise as Lord Valewyn spoke of efficiency, of ensuring there would be no confusion later, of how sensible it was to address such matters while everyone remained conveniently gathered. The language was mild, the tone indulgent, and yet beneath it lay the unmistakable weight of expectation, the assumption that she would comply because resistance had not been prepared for. She approached the table without haste, her movements measured, eyes scanning the pages with deliberate care rather than the quick deference anticipated. The terms were couched in reassurance, temporary guardianship, financial stewardship, protections framed as benefits, but the implications were stark enough once examined. Her autonomy narrowed, her choices deferred, her consent assumed rather than sought. Emotion rose sharp and immediate, a visceral recognition of how easily paper could accomplish what force could not, and for a fleeting moment fear pressed close, urging acquiescence as the safer path. Maribel acknowledged it, then set it aside. Fear, she had learned, was most dangerous when it disguised itself as reason. She did not raise her voice when she refused. There was no drama in it, no trembling appeal to sympathy, only a calm statement delivered with clarity and courtesy. She would not sign until she had sought independent counsel. The room stilled. The effect was immediate and unsettling, not because her words were harsh, but because they disrupted the rhythm the house relied upon to move unopposed. Politeness faltered, replaced by careful smiles and murmured assurances that such caution was unnecessary, that everything had been arranged in her best interest, that delay would only complicate matters. Maribel listened without interruption, her composure intact, then repeated herself with the same measured tone, neither escalating nor retreating, and in doing so drew a line that could not be mistaken for confusion. Nathaniel observed from a short distance away, saying nothing, yet noting with acute attention the way the Valewyns recalibrated, their confidence momentarily shaken by a refusal too dignified to punish openly. Emotionally, something like admiration stirred within him, tempered by respect. Maribel had not sought his intervention, nor leaned upon his presence to strengthen her stance. She had acted alone, decisively, and the recognition altered his understanding of her entirely. This was not endurance mistaken for passivity, but restraint wielded with precision. When the moment passed, and the papers were withdrawn under the pretense of reconsideration, Maribel felt the cost of her refusal settle quietly within her, an awareness that surveillance would tighten and consequences would follow. Yet beneath that knowledge ran a steadier current. She had spoken, clearly and without apology, and the house had been forced, however briefly, to listen. Nathaniel learned of the earlier woman by accident, which was to say he learned of her in the way truths were most often revealed within powerful houses, through omission rather than confession, through a name that was never spoken twice, a portrait that had been removed while its frame remained faintly outlined against the wall. He had been granted access to the Valewyn records under the guise of idle curiosity, a privilege extended to him without suspicion because blood and title still afforded trust, and it was there, amid ledgers and correspondence meant to preserve legacy, that he noticed the gaps: a marriage proposal abandoned without explanation, a dowry absorbed and never returned, letters that ended abruptly, their final lines cautious to the point of erasure. When he asked, casually, about the woman whose name appeared only once, the reply came too quickly, wrapped in dismissal and vague regret, and Nathaniel felt the unmistakable chill of something deliberately buried. Emotion rose then, sharp and unignorable, not as outrage but as recognition. He had seen this pattern before, had grown up hearing such stories reshaped into morality tales where obedience was praised and resistance quietly punished, and to witness it unfolding again, with Maribel positioned at its center, hardened something within him that restraint alone could no longer contain. This was not an isolated cruelty, nor a misjudgment made in haste. It was precedent, refined through repetition and protected by silence. The woman had not vanished in body, perhaps, but she had been erased all the same, her refusal recast as impropriety, her absence explained until explanation itself became unnecessary. The house had learned then that consequences could be avoided if inflicted quietly enough. When Nathaniel returned to the present, the corridors seemed narrower, the air heavier, and the politeness extended to him felt newly hollow. He sought Maribel later that day, not to alarm her, but to understand whether she had already sensed what he now knew, and when they spoke, his words were measured, his tone controlled, yet the gravity beneath them unmistakable. He told her only what was necessary, that House of Valewyn had precedent for punishing women who refused to comply, and that the danger she faced was not hypothetical. Maribel listened without interruption, her expression steady, long hair falling loose over one shoulder as she absorbed the truth, and though her hand tightened briefly where it rested, her voice did not waver when she replied. She had suspected as much, she said, and confirmation, however grim, did not frighten her so much as clarify what was required of her now. Emotionally, the exchange marked a shift for both of them. For Nathaniel, uncertainty fell away, replaced by resolve shaped into strategy rather than impulse. He would not allow this pattern to repeat unchallenged. For Maribel, fear gave way to something colder and more focused, an understanding that endurance alone would not protect her, and that silence, once again, was the very thing that would make her vulnerable. They parted with no promises spoken, yet both carried the same unspoken certainty. Whatever cost resistance demanded, it would be less than the price of allowing history to claim her as it had claimed others before. Maribel learned the truth about her family's debts in a manner so understated it might have been overlooked by anyone less attuned to nuance, delivered not as revelation but as reassurance during a conversation meant to soothe. An aunt spoke of relief, of burdens quietly lifted, of how fortunate it was that House of Valewyn possessed both the means and the generosity to resolve lingering obligations, and as the words settled, Maribel felt understanding strike with a precision that stole her breath. The debts had not been forgiven out of kindness. They had been acquired, purchased, absorbed, transformed into leverage so complete it no longer needed to announce itself as threat. Her fate, she realized, had been secured not merely through expectation, but through ownership disguised as benevolence. Emotion surged, sharp and immediate, not as panic, but as devastation layered with betrayal. She thought of letters from home written with careful optimism, of reassurances given without full knowledge, of a family that believed itself protected while its freedom was quietly surrendered on her behalf. For a moment, the weight of it pressed hard enough to fracture her composure, and she allowed herself the briefest pause, retreating to a quiet alcove where no eyes followed, long hair falling loose as she steadied her breathing and acknowledged the grief that rose alongside fury. This was not simply coercion, it was inheritance weaponized, obligation turned inward, until refusal threatened not only her future, but the survival of those she loved. When Nathaniel confirmed what she already suspected, doing so without ceremony or pity, the final shape of the trap revealed itself fully. He explained how the debts had been structured, how repayment had been deferred rather than erased, how compliance would be framed as resolution and resistance as recklessness. Maribel listened with a clarity that surprised even her, absorbing the information not as sentence but as map, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the tremor such knowledge was meant to provoke. She thanked him, not for the news, but for the honesty, and told him plainly that understanding the depth of the manipulation changed nothing essential about her resolve. If anything, it sharpened it. Emotionally, something decisive occurred within her then. The fear that had shadowed her steps since arrival did not vanish, but it lost its power to dictate her choices. She understood now that silence would cost her more than defiance ever could, that obedience would not protect her family so much as entrench their dependence, and that dignity, once surrendered, could not be reclaimed through compliance. Nathaniel watched the transformation with quiet intensity, recognizing in her steadiness not recklessness, but courage refined by clarity. As Maribel returned to the shared spaces of the house, her composure reassembled without fragility. She felt no illusion left to lose. Her fate had indeed been decided in silence, shaped through arrangements made without her voice, but knowledge had shifted the ground beneath her feet. She was no longer merely enduring a narrowing path. She was preparing to challenge it, fully aware of the cost, and resolved, with a calm that felt unbreakable, that whatever followed would be met not as victim, but as participant in her own survival. Nathaniel offered her escape that night with the same restraint he applied to everything else, presenting it not as salvation, but as option. Outlined calmly in the low light of a sitting room where even the walls seemed trained to listen, he explained how arrangements could be made quietly, how a carriage could depart before dawn, how illness or urgent family business would serve as explanation long enough to place distance between Maribel and House of Valewyn's immediate reach. There was no urgency in his tone, no pressure, only the clarity of a man who understood exactly what such an offer meant and refused to disguise it as heroism. Maribel listened without interruption, long hair unbound and falling freely down her back as she stood near the window, watching darkness settle over the grounds she now knew too well, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine what leaving might feel like, the relief of space, the absence of eyes, the illusion of safety purchased through disappearance. Emotion rose swiftly and was just as swiftly examined. Flight would spare her the immediate danger, she knew that, but it would also confirm every assumption the house had made about her, that she would yield if pressed hard enough, that silence and removal were interchangeable, that compliance could be achieved without ceremony. Worse still, it would leave her family bound by debts she could no longer contest openly, their security dependent on continued Valewyn goodwill, and that price settled heavily in her chest. When she turned back to Nathaniel, her decision had already formed, not from stubbornness or pride, but from conviction sharpened by understanding. She refused him gently and without apology. To leave in silence, she said, would be to accept the narrative already written for her, one in which her absence proved the house's righteousness rather than its cruelty. She would not be made into a cautionary absence, another woman whose name could be spoken once and then erased. Nathaniel did not argue. He absorbed her refusal with a stillness that conveyed respect rather than disappointment, recognizing the courage required to choose visibility over safety in a place that punished both. Emotionally, the moment altered something essential between them, shifting his role fully from potential rescuer to acknowledged ally. They spoke then of consequences rather than plans, of what retaliation might look like, of how patience would thin and pressure sharpen, and Maribel met each possibility with measured calm, not because she underestimated the danger, but because she had already accepted its reality. Nathaniel saw in her resolve not recklessness but clarity, the kind that made endurance a choice rather than a reflex, and it strengthened his own. If she would not flee, then he would not hedge. Neutrality, he understood now, would be its own form of betrayal. When they parted, it was with an understanding neither needed to name aloud. Whatever followed would be faced openly, without disappearance or apology. Maribel returned to her chamber and braided her long hair carefully before bed, the familiar motion steadying her thoughts, and as she lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the house, she felt no regret for refusing escape. Fear remained, real and insistent, but beneath it ran something stronger, a certainty that staying, speaking, and being seen were no longer acts of defiance alone, but of self-preservation. The announcement was prepared as spectacle, not because House of Valewyn valued celebration, but because visibility had always been its preferred method of enforcement. The ballroom was opened and dressed with ceremonial precision, light spilling from chandeliers polished to brilliance, banners unfurled to suggest continuity rather than conquest, and invitations dispatched with careful wording that framed the evening as inevitable rather than optional. Maribel was informed of the event as though it were a courtesy extended for her benefit, her presence assumed, her role already cast, and she received the news with composed acknowledgement, long hair arranged once more into elegant submission as attendants prepared her attire. The gown chosen was immaculate and restrained, designed not to draw admiration, but to signal suitability, its lines emphasizing propriety over individuality, and as she dressed, Maribel understood that this performance was meant to close the last remaining space for dissent. Once announced, once witnessed, silence would be recast as consent. Emotion pressed close as the evening approached, not in waves of panic but in steady accumulation, the weight of consequence settling with each passing hour. She moved through the house with deliberate calm, refusing both withdrawal and confrontation, aware that every glance measured her compliance, every smile catalogued as reassurance. Nathaniel watched the preparations with a restraint that bordered on violence, his stillness masking an internal reckoning that had been building since his arrival. He understood the intent clearly now. The announcement would force his hand as surely as it sought to bind Maribel's future, compelling him either to endorse the arrangement through presence or reveal dissent in full view of those who would remember it. When the ballroom filled, the air grew thick with expectation, conversation brightened by certainty rather than joy, and Maribel took her place where she had been guided, visible yet isolated, the focus of attention without the authority of voice. Nathaniel stood among the guests, positioned by design within sight of the family elders, his presence a calculated reassurance that no challenge would be offered. Emotion tightened in his chest as he met Maribel's gaze across the room, seeing not fear there, but resolve sharpened into stillness. The moment clarified everything. Silence, he realized, would no longer preserve neutrality, it would confirm complicity. As Lord Valewyn moved toward the dais, glass raised, prepared to speak words that would crystallize assumption into public fact, the tension became nearly unbearable, a held breath shared by those who believed themselves victorious. Maribel felt it keenly, the narrowing of possibility that accompanied ritual, yet she stood unbowed, her composure intact, not because she believed herself safe, but because she refused to offer the house the satisfaction of visible submission. Nathaniel drew a measured breath, his decision no longer theoretical, and as the room quieted in anticipation of proclamation, both understood that whatever followed would shatter the carefully maintained illusion that this fate had been agreed upon in harmony. Silence had carried them this far. It would not carry them through the night. Maribel did not intend to overhear the conversation, yet once the words reached her, they could not be unheard, carrying with them the same deliberate cruelty that defined every kindness House of Valewyn extended. She had stepped into a side corridor to steady herself before the announcement, the press of the ballroom growing heavy in her lungs when voices drifted through an adjoining door left carelessly ajar, confident in privacy that no longer existed. Lord Valewyn spoke first, his tone smooth, almost indulgent, remarking that resistance, should it arise, could be managed with minimal inconvenience. A reputation, he observed, was a fragile thing, and it took remarkably little effort to fracture one when guided by the proper hands. Another voice agreed, speaking of contingency rather than cruelty, of how swiftly sympathy shifted when rumor was offered structure, and Maribel felt the meaning of it settle coldly into place. If she refused, they would not argue with her. They would unmake her. The emotional impact was immediate and sharp, fear surging with enough force to threaten the careful control she had maintained for days, yet it did not consume her. Instead, it clarified. The danger she faced was no longer abstract or implied. It had been articulated plainly, discussed as strategy rather than consequence, and in that blunt acknowledgement something decisive occurred within her. She understood then that silence would not protect her, that compliance would not earn mercy, and that the house's restraint was reserved only for those who did not challenge its authority. Whatever choice she made now would be punished if it did not serve them, and knowing that stripped fear of its power to deceive her into obedience. She withdrew before her presence could be detected, her steps measured, her expression composed as she re-entered the public spaces of the house, long hair smooth against her back, posture unbroken. No one noticed the shift within her, yet it was profound. The woman who had endured in order to survive had given way to one who understood that survival required confrontation, however carefully executed. She did not seek Nathaniel immediately, not from doubt, but from resolve. She needed no reassurance, only readiness. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel sensed the change the moment their eyes met again. There was a steadiness in Maribel's gaze that had not been there before, a clarity that suggested knowledge newly claimed and accepted. Emotion tightened in his chest, not as fear for her alone, but as recognition that the house had crossed a threshold it could not retreat from. He moved closer under the guise of circulation, positioning himself where his presence was unavoidable, where his silence would now be read as intention rather than courtesy. As the final preparations for the announcement continued, the air thick with anticipation and certainty, Maribel stood quietly within the narrowing space allotted to her and felt no impulse to retreat. Terror had been offered as lesson, but it had instead delivered clarity. She would not be erased quietly. If her reputation was to be risked, it would be in defense of her voice rather than surrendered to protect the comfort of those who sought to silence her. The knowledge steadied her completely. Whatever happened next, she would meet it openly, no longer guessing at the cost, and no longer willing to pay it in silence. The gallery lay beyond the ballroom like a held breath, a long corridor of oil, darkened faces and gilt frames that chronicled House of Valewyn's triumphs without recording its costs, and it was there that Nathaniel found Maribel when the music swelled behind them and the announcement drew nearer. The light was softer here, filtered through high windows, and the hush carried none of the coercive weight of the public rooms, only the quiet vigilance of history observing the present. Maribel stood before a portrait of a long, dead matriarch, hands folded with deliberate calm, her long hair falling unbound over one shoulder as if she had set aside ornament in favor of honesty, and when Nathaniel spoke her name, it was with care, as though sound itself might tilt the moment. He did not offer reassurance. He did not ask if she was prepared. Instead, he named what pressed against them both, that the house intended to seal her fate with spectacle, and that silence now would be interpreted as assent beyond dispute. Maribel turned to him fully, her expression composed but intent, and admitted the truth she had not yet spoken aloud, that she was afraid, not of scandal alone, but of believing that he would stand beside her when the cost became undeniable. The confession was not plea or accusation, but clarity, offered without ornament. Nathaniel received it without defensiveness, recognizing the courage it took to voice doubt rather than hide behind politeness, and he answered with an honesty equally unadorned. He told her that the Valewyn bloodline, as it was practiced here, disgusted him tonight, that tradition wielded without conscience was not heritage but rot, and that if he remained silent now, he would carry that silence as a stain he could not later erase. The words were controlled, measured, yet unmistakably resolved, and Maribel felt something settle within her at their weight. Emotion moved between them with quiet intensity, not the rush of confession, but the steadier recognition of shared risk. Neither reached for the other. Neither promised what could not yet be guaranteed. Instead, they stood in the space between declaration and action, acknowledging what resistance would demand and choosing, together, to meet it without illusion. Maribel felt the last remnants of uncertainty loosen, replaced by a grounded resolve that did not require certainty of outcome to exist. She did not ask Nathaniel what he would do. She understood now that the choice would be made in public, where it mattered, and that whatever he chose, she would no longer be alone in choosing herself. When footsteps approached and voices drifted closer, the gallery's stillness tightened, and the moment narrowed to what would follow. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect rather than farewell, and Maribel returned it with equal composure, her posture unbowed, her gaze steady. As they turned back toward the ballroom, the portraits watched without judgment, their painted eyes fixed on a threshold being crossed not by force or fate, but by decision. Whatever House of Valewyn intended to claim through silence would now be contested in daylight, and as the music swelled once more, Maribel stepped forward with a calm that felt earned, knowing that courage did not require certainty, only the refusal to let fear speak last. Nathaniel moved through the remainder of the evening with deliberate calm, his mind already shifting from confrontation to precision, understanding that courage alone would not dismantle House of Valewyn's certainty without structure to support it. While the ballroom filled with murmured anticipation and the ritual of announcement hovered close, he excused himself under the pretense of necessity, seeking instead the quieter rooms where documents were kept and assumptions rarely questioned. Years spent navigating aristocratic systems had taught him that tradition often survived not because it was sound, but because no one bothered to examine its foundations closely, and it was there, within the ledgers, correspondence, and recorded agreements, that he focused his attention. He reviewed wills that referenced guardianship in vague terms, noted inconsistencies in the timing of debt transfers, and traced how obligations had been shifted rather than resolved, the language carefully chosen to imply consent where none had been granted. Emotion did not cloud his assessment. Instead, resolve sharpened his focus, transforming indignation into strategy. What he discovered confirmed his instincts. House of Valewyn's authority over Maribel's future relied less on law than on intimidation sustained by reputation, a network of influence so accustomed to obedience it rarely tested its own limits. Certain claims were outdated, others misapplied, and some depended entirely on silence rather than enforceable right. Nathaniel understood then that the family's greatest strength, the confidence with which it moved unchallenged, was also its vulnerability. Exposure, rather than opposition, would unravel what force never could. The realization steadied him, replacing urgency with purpose. When he returned to the public spaces, the shift within him was unmistakable, though outwardly nothing had changed. He stood with renewed stillness, his presence no longer passive but intentional, aware that each moment before intervention was necessary preparation rather than delay. Across the room, Maribel sensed it before she saw it, the way his attention sharpened, the way his silence now carried weight rather than avoidance. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance passed understanding without need for words. The ground beneath House of Valewyn was less solid than it appeared. Emotionally, Maribel felt the difference immediately. The fear that had once tightened her breath eased into something steadier, not hope exactly, but trust grounded in action rather than promise. She remained where she was placed, visible and composed, refusing to retreat or provoke, allowing the house to continue its performance while unaware that its script had begun to fray. The knowledge that Nathaniel was preparing to act, not impulsively, but with intent, gave her strength that did not depend on rescue, only on shared resolve. As the final moments before announcement approached, the tension in the room sharpened, certainty edging toward triumph among those who believed the outcome secured. Nathaniel drew a measured breath, the weight of what he was about to risk fully understood and fully accepted. This was no longer a matter of preference or sympathy, but of choice, between preserving comfort and dismantling injustice. And as the first words of proclamation were prepared, both he and Maribel stood ready, not knowing exactly how the rupture would unfold, but certain now that silence would not be the force that decided it. The letter arrived the following morning on a silver tray carried with ceremonial care, its seal intact, its script refined enough to suggest benevolence rather than threat, and Maribel understood the intention the moment she saw it. It was addressed to her with affectionate precision, the handwriting elegant, the phrasing chosen to disarm rather than alarm, and she accepted it with a polite nod, waiting until the servant had withdrawn before breaking the seal. The contents were no surprise, yet the chill they carried settled deeply all the same. A Valewyn lady, positioned carefully as confidante rather than enforcer, wrote of concern and protection, of how fragile reputation could be when misunderstood, and of how easily society mistook independence for impropriety. Compliance, the letter suggested, would ensure safety, dignity, and continued respect. Resistance, though never named as such, was framed as risk, avoidable, unnecessary, and deeply regrettable. Maribel read the letter twice, not because the meaning was unclear, but because she wished to understand the craftsmanship of the threat. It was not cruelty that made it dangerous, but kindness feigned with enough conviction to confuse those who wished to believe in it. The message was simple beneath its ornament: submit quietly and be shielded, or speak and be destroyed with equal quiet. Emotion stirred sharply, fear pressing close with the weight of consequence, yet she did not allow it to dictate her response. Instead, she folded the letter carefully, noting how language could be weaponized as efficiently as force, and felt her resolve settle into something colder and more exact. Silence, she recognized, was being offered as mercy. She refused it internally without hesitation. Nathaniel learned of the letter later that day, not from Maribel's confession but from the shift he sensed in her bearing, the way her composure carried an added edge of clarity rather than strain. When she showed it to him, doing so without embellishment or complaint, he read it with growing distaste, recognizing the tactic immediately. This was how power preserved itself, through the illusion of choice presented where none truly existed. Emotion flared briefly, then disciplined itself into focus. He told Maribel plainly that such letters often preceded escalation, that the house would now test her willingness to be intimidated before resorting to more overt measures. Maribel listened and nodded, unsurprised. Emotionally, the letter had already accomplished one thing it was never meant to do. It had stripped away her last lingering doubt that cooperation might soften the outcome. There would be no mercy granted for obedience, only absorption. Relationship movement deepened quietly as she and Nathaniel aligned without need for reassurance, their understanding now grounded in shared recognition of the stakes. They spoke not of fear, but of clarity, of remaining visible, of allowing no private misstep to be reshaped into public fiction. When Maribel returned to her room, she placed the letter in a drawer rather than destroying it, recognizing its future value not as threat, but as evidence. As she smoothed her long hair before the mirror, her expression calm and unwavering, she felt no illusion left to protect. House of Valewyn had extended its warning. She had received it, understood it, and chosen, with steady certainty, not to comply. Nathaniel spoke to her with the care of a man who understood that warnings could wound as deeply as threats if delivered without restraint, choosing a quiet corner of the library where the tall shelves offered both witness and protection, and he did not soften what he needed to say. The house, he told her, would not rely on letters alone. Courtesy had its limits, and once those limits were tested, strategy would sharpen. They might attempt to engineer a moment that could be framed as indiscretion, an encounter without witnesses, a misunderstanding positioned as intimacy, a circumstance arranged carefully enough to appear accidental. It was not accusation he offered, but preparation, an acknowledgement of how reputations were dismantled not through lies alone, but through situations designed to invite them. Maribel listened without interruption, long hair braided neatly over one shoulder, her posture attentive rather than defensive, absorbing the reality of what vigilance would now require. Emotion stirred, not as fear, but as anger controlled into focus. She understood the tactic immediately, recognizing the familiarity of systems that punished women for existing in proximity to power. Nathaniel outlined boundaries not as rules imposed upon her, but as shields they would maintain together, never allowing her to be alone in unobserved spaces, ensuring invitations were accepted publicly or declined with record, moving through the house with visibility that denied opportunity for fabrication. The language he used was precise, careful to emphasize choice rather than control, and Maribel felt the respect in it keenly. She agreed without hesitation, not because she wished to be protected, but because she refused to be cornered. Relationship movement shifted into something firmer and more defined, a partnership rooted in mutual vigilance rather than dependence. They spoke openly of how easily propriety could be manipulated, how silence could be reshaped into implication, and how presence, deliberate, witnessed presence, was now an act of defense. Nathaniel did not pretend that such caution would be easy, nor did he disguise the toll it might take, but Maribel met each consideration with steady resolve, understanding that awareness, once gained, demanded discipline to sustain. As they parted, the house seemed to close ranks almost audibly, corridors narrowing with expectation, yet Maribel moved through them with composed clarity, refusing the instinct to withdraw. She greeted others when encountered, lingered where she could be seen, and maintained her composure with a steadiness that signaled neither submission nor defiance, but refusal to be hidden. The effort was taxing, yet it carried its own quiet power, transforming her presence into a constant reminder that she could not be erased without consequence. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Maribel loosened her braid and let her long hair fall free once more, the familiar motion grounding her thoughts. She understood now that protection did not always arrive as rescue. Sometimes it took the form of structure, of shared attention, of refusing isolation, even when solitude beckoned. House of Valewyn might still believe it could manufacture silence through circumstance, but she was no longer alone in anticipating its moves. Awareness had become strategy, and strategy, she knew with calm certainty, would be her shield, until the moment arrived to speak aloud what the house most feared being named. The opportunity was engineered with the same careful politeness that had marked every other attempt to narrow her choices, presented as accident rather than design, and Maribel sensed it the moment the corridor emptied too quickly to be coincidence. She had been directed toward a lesser, used wing under the pretense of viewing a recently restored portrait, the suggestion offered lightly, almost thoughtfully, and she accepted only because refusal would have drawn attention too early. The doors closed behind her with a soft finality that carried intent, and when she turned, the intended groom stood waiting, his expression composed, his confidence untroubled, as though the situation itself had been promised to him. The realization struck cleanly. This was meant to be witnessed later, not interrupted now, framed as chance intimacy rather than confinement. Emotion surged, sharp and immediate, but Maribel did not allow it command. She took in the space, the narrow windows, the lack of exits, the calculated privacy, and adjusted her stance accordingly, keeping distance without provoking pursuit, her long hair loosening slightly at her shoulders as she shifted. The groom spoke first, his tone familiar in a way that assumed progress already made, suggesting concern for her comfort, remarking on how overwhelmed she must be, offering reassurance that could be reshaped into implication if repeated by another mouth. Maribel responded with calm precision, neither engaging nor retreating, acknowledging nothing that could be twisted into consent, and when he stepped closer, she did not raise her voice or retreat into silence. Instead, she named the circumstance clearly and without accusation, stating that she would not be alone in a private space and asking that the door be opened at once. The request unsettled him. Confidence faltered where entitlement had expected compliance, and when he attempted to reframe the moment as misunderstanding, Maribel did not argue. She moved instead, positioning herself deliberately where she could be seen from the hall, her posture unbroken, her expression composed, and called for assistance with a tone that invited no panic and no apology. The response was swift. Servants appeared, the door was opened, and the carefully arranged privacy dissolved into visibility that could not be denied. The groom withdrew with practiced dignity, offering explanations already shaped to protect himself, but the narrative he sought to construct had been disrupted beyond repair. Nathaniel arrived moments later, drawn by the disturbance, and took in the scene with immediate clarity. He said nothing in the moment, understanding that commentary would only invite reinterpretation, but his presence alone altered the aftermath, anchoring the truth in witness rather than rumor. Maribel felt the tremor of delayed reaction then, fear brushing close now that danger had passed, yet it did not overwhelm her. She remained steady, answering questions simply, offering no embellishment that could be seized and reshaped. Emotionally, the encounter marked a decisive shift. What had been threat had become attempt, and attempt had failed. Maribel understood now that vigilance was not paranoia but necessity, and that clarity, calmly asserted, could dismantle even carefully laid traps. As she returned to her room later, her long hair fully loose, breath finally unguarded, she felt no triumph, only resolve reinforced. House of Valewyn had tested her willingness to be cornered and found it wanting. Whatever came next would not be met with confusion or retreat. She had escaped not through secrecy, but through composure made visible, and the knowledge steadied her for the confrontations yet to come. Nathaniel did not seek Lord Valewyn immediately, understanding that timing could lend weight to words as surely as volume, and when he did request the meeting, it was framed as courtesy rather than confrontation, a private conversation suggested with the same polished restraint the house favored when it believed itself in control. They met in the study where decisions were usually confirmed rather than questioned. The door closed with deliberate calm, and for a moment the air held the pretense of civility that had sustained Valewyn authority for generations. Lord Valewyn gestured toward a chair that Nathaniel declined, choosing instead to remain standing, his posture composed, his expression unreadable, and the subtle refusal shifted the balance before a word was spoken. He began without accusation, naming the incident plainly and precisely, stripping it of interpretation before it could be reshaped. He spoke of engineered privacy, of assumptions made without consent, of how easily such situations could be weaponized, and as he did, he watched the older man's confidence recalibrate, hardening rather than softening. Lord Valewyn responded with practiced dismissal, framing the encounter as misunderstanding, suggesting Maribel's nerves had rendered her overly cautious, implying that intent mattered less than perception in the delicate matter of reputation. The words were smooth, almost sympathetic, and beneath them lay the same unyielding certainty Nathaniel had come to recognize as the house's true voice. Emotion tightened in Nathaniel's chest, not as anger, but as clarity. He named the pattern then, carefully and without heat, pointing out how often Valewyn misunderstandings seemed to benefit the house while costing others their dignity. He stated plainly that the coercion must end, that Maribel Thorne's consent could not be manufactured through pressure, debt, or circumstance, and that further attempts would not be met with silence. Lord Valewyn's response was immediate and chilling. He reminded Nathaniel of alliances forged in blood, of obligations inherited rather than chosen, and of how loyalty was measured not by sentiment, but by compliance. To challenge Valewyn authority, he implied, was to betray one's own lineage. The moment crystallized everything. Nathaniel felt the last remnants of restraint give way to resolve shaped into purpose. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He stated, with measured certainty, that tradition wielded without conscience was not authority but abuse, and that any alliance demanding silence in the face of coercion was already fractured. The words landed with quiet force, and Lord Valewyn's expression shifted, not to anger, but to calculation, as though reassessing the cost of a conflict he had not anticipated. When the meeting ended, it did so without resolution, the politeness restored just enough to conceal the rupture now running beneath it. Nathaniel left the study with the understanding that neutrality had ended, and that whatever followed would carry consequence. Yet beneath the weight of that knowledge lay a steadier certainty. He had crossed the threshold deliberately, naming what the house relied upon never being spoken aloud. Later, when he encountered Maribel in a public room and met her gaze briefly, no words passed between them, yet understanding did. She saw in his stillness not retreat but alignment, and the knowledge steadied her. House of Valewyn had been confronted openly at last, and while the danger had not diminished, it had changed form. Silence had been challenged, and once challenged, it could never again claim inevitability. Maribel's relatives arrived 2 days later with the efficiency of inevitability, summoned under the pretense of reassurance and unity, and from the moment she saw them cross the threshold of the Valewyn estate, she understood how thoroughly the house had prepared its ground. They greeted her with warmth edged by relief, speaking of security and gratitude, of how fortunate she was to be considered worthy of such protection, and each word carried the unmistakable echo of narratives already shaped without her input. Her aunt clasped her hands with affection that trembled just slightly. Her uncle spoke of obligations settled and futures secured, and Maribel felt the slow, precise devastation of realizing that those meant to shield her had been convinced that her silence was not only necessary, but virtuous. Emotion surged, sharper than fear, because this betrayal arrived wrapped in love. She listened as they praised the arrangement, as they urged her toward acceptance framed as maturity rather than surrender, and she understood that they believed themselves advocates, not accomplices. The house had offered them relief from anxiety they could not afford to carry, and in return, it had claimed her compliance as collateral. Maribel did not interrupt. She allowed them to speak fully, noting how often her wishes were referenced without being asked, how frequently her strength was invoked as justification for enduring what should never have been demanded. When she finally responded, her voice was calm, stripped of appeal or accusation, and she named the truth plainly. That protection purchased through her silence was not protection at all, and that obedience would bind their future to a house that used generosity as leash. The reaction was immediate and painful. Confusion flickered, followed by concern, then by the quiet insistence that she was misreading intent, that powerful families operated differently, that sacrifice was sometimes required for collective good. The words struck deeply, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how thoroughly coercion had been normalized, how easily love could be conscripted into service of control. For a moment, the weight of isolation pressed close, heavier than it had ever been among the Valewyns themselves, and Maribel felt the instinct to yield stir dangerously near. She did not. Instead, she drew upon the clarity earned through days of vigilance and confrontation, and she refused gently but firmly to be the instrument of their comfort. She stated that she would not sign away her autonomy to secure their peace, and that any future built on her silence would be unstable by design. The words were not dramatic, but they were irrevocable, and as she spoke them, something within her settled into place, a courage no longer reactive but chosen. Nathaniel observed from the edge of the room, offering no intervention, respecting the necessity of this moment belonging to her alone. When her relatives departed, shaken and uncertain, Maribel remained standing, her composure intact, despite the cost. Emotion lingered, grief, loss, a quiet mourning, but beneath it ran a steadier current of resolve. She had faced not only the house that sought to claim her, but the loved ones who had unknowingly delivered her into its hands, and she had not broken. Later, as she smoothed her long hair back into order and prepared to re-enter the shared spaces of the estate, Maribel understood with quiet certainty that the final illusion had fallen. No one would save her by accident. If freedom was to be claimed, it would be through clarity, courage, and the refusal to allow even love to be weaponized against her. Nathaniel did not present the alternative lightly, nor did he cloak it in reassurance meant to soften its impact, and when he spoke to Maribel that evening, it was with the deliberate seriousness of a man who understood that words, once offered, could not be retrieved. They met in a sitting room chosen for its openness rather than privacy, doors unclosed, lamps lit to deny shadow, and he outlined the course before him with careful precision. He would challenge the engagement publicly, not through insult or spectacle, but through law and record, naming the manipulation of debts, the abuse of assumed guardianship, and the absence of consent upon which the entire arrangement rested. It would not be quiet. It would not be contained. Once begun, it would mark him unmistakably as adversary to House of Valewyn. Emotion surfaced immediately, not as fear for himself, but as measured recognition of cost. Nathaniel spoke of alliances that would fracture, invitations that would vanish, of how quickly influence could curdle into hostility when tradition was named rather than obeyed. He acknowledged, without embellishment, that such a challenge would tether his future to uncertainty and invite scrutiny not only of his motives, but of his blood, his past, his legitimacy within circles that prized silence over conscience. He did not ask Maribel to accept this sacrifice. He named it so she could understand the weight of what he was prepared to do. Maribel listened with composed attention, long hair drawn loosely over one shoulder, her expression intent rather than startled. Emotion stirred, gratitude edged with unease, not because she doubted his resolve, but because she understood too well the danger of being rescued through another bargain. She did not respond at once. Instead, she considered the implications carefully, weighing not the comfort of intervention, but the integrity of it. When she spoke, her voice was calm and unambiguous. She told him she would not be defended by an act that rendered her passive once more, nor would she allow her freedom to be purchased at the cost of his agency alone. If he acted, she said, it must be with her standing openly beside him, her voice present, her consent explicit. The exchange altered the shape of their alliance decisively. What had been alignment born of shared outrage became commitment grounded in equality. Nathaniel received her words without resistance, recognizing in them not refusal, but condition, the insistence that rescue without respect was merely another form of control. Emotionally, something steadied within him, a clarity that replaced impulse with purpose. He agreed, without hesitation, that any challenge he mounted would include her testimony, her presence, her choice. They spoke then of preparation rather than fear, of evidence to be gathered, of witnesses to be named, of how daylight, once invited, could dismantle what secrecy sustained. The conversation was practical, restrained, and unadorned, yet beneath it ran a quiet intensity born of mutual trust. When they parted, it was with understanding rather than promise, both aware that the path ahead would demand endurance rather than triumph. As Maribel returned to her room that night, the house seemed newly alert, as though sensing the shift it could not yet identify. She braided her long hair slowly, the familiar motion grounding her resolve, and felt no illusion left to lose. The alternative had been named at last, not as escape or accommodation, but as confrontation shaped by choice. Whatever followed, it would be faced openly, with her voice intact and her agency unclaimed by anyone but herself. Maribel did not waver once the course had been named, yet she insisted on shaping it with the same care she applied to every choice that would bear her name, and when she spoke again, it was not to refine Nathaniel's resolve, but to define her own. She told him plainly that she would not stand quietly at his shoulder as symbol or consequence, nor would she allow the narrative to be framed as his conscience rescuing her from circumstance. If House of Valewyn was to be challenged, it would be challenged by two voices, not one elevated above the other, and her presence would be neither ornament nor evidence alone, but declaration. The words were steady, unadorned, and carried the unmistakable authority of a woman who had been tested long enough to know precisely what she would no longer accept. Emotions stirred between them, not in the heat of argument, but in the clarity of alignment. Nathaniel listened without interruption, recognizing the necessity of what she demanded, and the courage it took to demand it, and when he answered, it was with unequivocal agreement. He acknowledged that any challenge that silenced her again, however well-intentioned, would merely replicate the very abuse it sought to dismantle. He would not speak over her, he would not decide for her. Whatever unfolded would do so with her voice present, her consent explicit, her autonomy visible in every step. The understanding transformed their alliance into something both firmer and more exposed. They spoke then of how easily intention could be misread, of how even principled defiance would be twisted by those invested in preserving order, and of how standing together did not mean dissolving into one cause, but maintaining parallel resolve. Maribel felt the steadiness of it settle into her bones, replacing the last remnants of reactive courage with something quieter and more durable. She was no longer bracing for impact, she was choosing position. As they parted, the house's vigilance sharpened almost imperceptibly. Invitations were extended with new insistence, corridors subtly redirected, opportunities for private counsel narrowed under the guise of concern, and Maribel moved through it all with deliberate visibility, her long hair worn simply, her posture composed, her presence neither challenging nor yielding. Each step was chosen, each interaction measured, and the effort of it was considerable, yet it carried a strange calm. For the first time since arriving, she was not reacting to pressure alone, she was setting terms within it. That evening, she stood before the mirror and studied her reflection with a frankness that surprised her. She saw not only the woman others sought to manage, but the one who had endured, observed, and learned. The knowledge steadied her. She understood now that courage did not always arrive as dramatic refusal, but as the insistence on standing openly where others preferred compliance to remain unseen. When she turned from the mirror and returned to the shared spaces of the estate, she carried herself with a quiet assurance that required no validation. House of Valewyn continued its preparations, confident in spectacle and habit, unaware that the ground beneath its certainty had been claimed by two people unwilling to be arranged into silence. Maribel felt no anticipation of triumph, only readiness, and it was enough. The path ahead would not be gentle, but it would be hers, and she would walk it neither hidden nor alone. The gathering at the chapel was framed as reverent rather than declarative, an assembly dressed in the language of blessing to disguise the finality it intended to impose, and Maribel recognized the tactic immediately. The chapel itself had been prepared with restrained grandeur, candles aligned with ceremonial precision, banners softened by religious symbolism meant to lend inevitability, the comfort of sanctity, and guests ushered into place with the quiet confidence of those who believed the outcome beyond dispute. She was dressed early, attended with a care that bordered on reverence, her long hair arranged to suggest obedience rather than beauty, each pin placed to still movement, to signal readiness, to present her as composed offering rather than participant. Maribel accepted the attention with calm acknowledgement, refusing both resistance and gratitude, understanding that the performance relied upon her appearing willing even as her voice remained uninvited. Emotion settled into her with unexpected steadiness as she was guided toward the front, the murmurs behind her rising and falling like breath held by a single body. Fear did not dominate the moment. It hovered, present and acknowledged, but beneath it ran clarity honed by days of vigilance and refusal. She understood that the house intended to sanctify what it could not justify, to wrap coercion in ritual until dissent appeared sacrilegious rather than principled. The knowledge steadied her rather than weakened her, anchoring resolve where doubt might once have lived. Nathaniel entered moments later, His presence immediately registered despite the hush, and Maribel felt the shift as keenly as a change in air pressure. He took his place among the witnesses with deliberate composure, his expression unreadable, his stillness purposeful rather than passive, and their eyes met only briefly, a shared acknowledgement passing without display. He would not intervene yet. He would allow the house to reveal itself fully before naming what it sought to conceal, and the discipline of that restraint reinforced Maribel's own. As the officiant began to speak, invoking tradition, duty, and continuity, Maribel listened with careful attention, noting the language chosen to imply consent where none had been sought, the phrasing designed to close space rather than invite response. She remained silent, not from acquiescence, but from calculation, understanding that interruption without structure would be dismissed as hysteria rather than heard as truth. The house depended upon spectacle to enforce compliance. She would depend upon timing. The moment narrowed as the officiant paused, preparing to announce the binding arrangement that would transform assumption into record, and the chapel held its breath. Maribel felt the weight of expectation settle fully, the culmination of every quiet pressure applied since her arrival, and she did not bow beneath it. Her posture remained composed, her gaze steady, her long hair smooth against her back, and she understood with sudden clarity that courage did not require certainty of outcome, only refusal to be erased. Nathaniel drew a measured breath. The ground had been prepared, the witnesses gathered, the ritual exposed. Whatever followed would fracture the illusion of harmony House of Valewyn relied upon, and as the officiant opened his mouth to speak, the words meant to seal her fate. Both Maribel and Nathaniel stood ready, not to disrupt blindly, but to replace silence with truth, spoken aloud at last. Nathaniel stepped forward before the words could be spoken, the movement measured rather than abrupt, and the effect was immediate, a ripple of surprise passing through the chapel as attention shifted from ritual to interruption. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture for drama. He spoke clearly, addressing the officiant first, then the assembled witnesses, naming his objection with the precision of a man accustomed to being heard. He stated that the arrangement about to be announced lacked lawful consent, that it rested upon coercive leverage rather than voluntary agreement, and that proceeding would formalize an injustice already practiced in silence. The chapel stilled, the hush no longer reverent but stunned, and Maribel felt the weight of the moment settle fully into her bones. Nathaniel continued without haste, producing documents gathered with deliberate care, records of debt acquisition structured to compel compliance, correspondence that assumed guardianship never granted, agreements that relied upon reputation rather than enforceable right. He did not accuse recklessly. He named facts, placed them in sequence, and allowed their cumulative force to speak. Each revelation stripped away another layer of inevitability, exposing the scaffolding beneath House of Valewyn's authority, and as murmurs spread among the witnesses, certainty began to fracture into confusion. The power of spectacle shifted, no longer enforcing silence but amplifying truth. Maribel stepped forward then, not summoned, not guided, but choosing the moment as deliberately as he had. She stood beside Nathaniel rather than behind him, her presence unmistakable, her posture composed, her long hair smooth against her back, and she spoke with calm clarity that carried to the furthest pew. She stated plainly that she had not consented to the engagement, that her silence had been assumed rather than offered, and that every attempt to secure her compliance had relied upon pressure, debt, or threat rather than choice. There was no tremor in her voice, no appeal to sympathy, only the steady authority of truth, spoken aloud at last. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Lord Valewyn rose, his expression hardening as he attempted to reclaim control through indignation, accusing Nathaniel of impropriety and Maribel of misunderstanding generosity. Yet the words landed differently now, stripped of the silence that had once protected them. Witnesses shifted, glances exchanged, and the officiant hesitated visibly, uncertainty replacing ritual confidence. What had been framed as blessing now stood exposed as coercion under scrutiny. Emotion surged through Maribel, not fear, but liberation edged with vulnerability, as she realized that what could no longer be undone had been done. The house could retaliate, society could judge, but her voice had entered the record irreversibly, and whatever followed would proceed in daylight rather than shadow. Nathaniel remained steady beside her, neither shielding nor overshadowing, allowing her words to stand on their own weight. As the chapel dissolved into argument and disbelief, Maribel understood with quiet certainty that the most dangerous moment had already passed. Silence had been broken, not with spectacle, but with precision, and once broken, it could not be restored by force. Whatever House of Valewyn attempted next would be response rather than decree, and in that shift lay the first true measure of freedom she had claimed since her arrival. The eruption that followed was swift and uneven, voices rising not in unison but in competing claims of authority, outrage, and disbelief, and the chapel, so carefully arranged to sanctify certainty, became a chamber of fracture where order revealed its fragility. Lord Valewyn spoke first, loudly, and with practiced indignation, invoking lineage and propriety as shields against scrutiny, declaring the proceedings interrupted by insolence rather than conscience, yet his words no longer settled as they once had. They struck air already altered by evidence and testimony, and Maribel watched as certainty failed to reassert itself, slipping instead into repetition that sounded increasingly like insistence rather than truth. The officiant attempted to restore calm, hands raised, voice uncertain, and the witnesses, drawn by invitation into complicity, shifted uneasily, the weight of observation now pressing upon them as well. Maribel stood without moving, her composure intact, despite the tumult, long hair still smooth against her back, posture neither defensive nor defiant. She felt the tremor of delayed reaction rise through her chest, the body's insistence on acknowledging danger once it had passed. Yet she remained steady, anchoring herself in the clarity of what she had spoken. When Lord Valewyn turned his ire toward her directly, accusing her of ingratitude and dramatization, she answered once and only once, stating calmly that generosity did not require coercion and that consent, once absent, could not be retroactively assumed. The simplicity of the response carried more force than any raised voice, and the murmurs that followed were no longer dismissive. Nathaniel intervened again, not to dominate the exchange but to contain it, reminding the assembly that legality did not yield to indignation and that the documents presented demanded consideration regardless of offense taken. He did not threaten consequence. He named process. The distinction mattered, and it shifted the room further from performance toward reckoning. Those present began to recognize that to proceed now would be to witness, not blessing, but violation made public, and the hesitation spread. The intended groom attempted retreat through civility, expressing concern for Maribel's distress, offering postponement framed as kindness, but the gesture arrived too late and rang hollow. Maribel declined with measured courtesy, stating that postponement without acknowledgement changed nothing essential, and the refusal closed another door the house had relied upon to regain control. Emotion moved through her then, not as fear, but as relief edged with grief for what had been necessary to endure before truth could be spoken. As the officiant declared the proceedings suspended pending review, the declaration landed like a verdict rather than a pause. The ritual dissolved, candles guttering, guests standing uncertainly as roles fell away, and House of Valewyn's authority, so long enforced through momentum, found itself abruptly stalled. Maribel felt the shift keenly. The future remained uncertain, but it was no longer predetermined. When she turned toward Nathaniel amid the dispersing crowd, their exchange was brief and unremarkable to others, a nod, a shared stillness, but it carried weight. They had not won safety. They had claimed voice. Whatever retaliation followed would now be response, rather than decree, and as Maribel stepped out of the chapel into open air, the silence that followed her was no longer imposed. It was chosen, and it belonged to her. Lord Valewyn did not allow uncertainty to linger unchallenged for long, and when he spoke again, it was with a precision sharpened for retaliation rather than reconciliation. He addressed the gathering not as an accused man defending himself, but as a patriarch correcting a breach of order, his voice lowered deliberately, his tone controlled to suggest reason where anger might have undermined him. He named Nathaniel directly, invoking a connection long unspoken, a maternal tie woven generations earlier into Valewyn legacy agreements meant to bind allied bloodlines through obligation rather than affection. The revelation landed with calculated force. Nathaniel Blackmere, he declared, was not merely an outsider meddling in family affairs, but a beneficiary of Valewyn lineage himself, bound by inheritance pacts that demanded loyalty, discretion, and silence above all else. The effect was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the remaining witnesses, curiosity sharpening into judgment as the narrative shifted, recasting Nathaniel's intervention not as conscience but as betrayal. Lord Valewyn pressed the advantage smoothly, framing Nathaniel's actions as serving defiance rather than principled dissent, suggesting that his objections arose not from concern for Maribel's autonomy, but from ambition and disloyalty toward his own blood. The accusation was delivered without raised voice, its cruelty rooted in implication rather than attack, and Maribel felt the weight of it keenly, recognizing the tactic for what it was: isolation through reframing, the transformation of integrity into treachery. Nathaniel did not interrupt. He absorbed the words with composed stillness, understanding that denial alone would grant them undue power. The truth of the connection was not false, yet it had never been consented to in the way Valewyn authority implied, and he understood now that the house had been waiting for this moment, reserving lineage as weapon to be deployed when moral challenge threatened control. Emotion stirred, anger, yes, but also clarity, as he recognized how tradition was being used not to preserve heritage, but to enforce silence through shame. Maribel stepped closer then, not to speak yet, but to stand visibly beside him, her movement deliberate, unmistakable. The gesture carried meaning without words. She did not retreat from the association being cast upon him, nor did she allow the accusation to recast her as pawn between men. Her presence signaled choice, not obligation, and the distinction mattered. Those watching saw not a duke isolated by blood, but two figures aligned by decision. Lord Valewyn pressed once more, warning of consequence, of estrangement, of lost standing, of doors closed forever to those who turned against their own lineage. The threat was offered calmly, as though exile was simply the natural order restored, and Maribel understood with sudden clarity that this was the house's final line of defense. The insistence that belonging was conditional upon obedience. Emotion tightened in her chest, not with fear, but with resolve, as she realized how thoroughly silence had been sanctified as virtue. Nathaniel drew a measured breath, the weight of what he was about to reject fully present, and the chapel stilled once more. The house had named its claim. What followed would determine whether blood or conscience would be allowed to speak last. Nathaniel answered without haste, his voice steady enough that it carried farther than volume ever could, and in the stillness that followed, the power of the house wavered for the first time in generations. He did not deny the blood tie Lord Valewyn had invoked, nor did he allow it to define him. Instead, he named it plainly, stripping it of mystique and obligation alike, stating that lineage without consent was not loyalty but coercion, and that any bond requiring silence in the face of harm forfeited its claim to honor. The words were neither angry nor performative. They were measured, precise, and devastating in their clarity, and as he spoke, the narrative Lord Valewyn had attempted to impose began to unravel. He acknowledged the agreements forged before his birth, the expectations layered upon him without his choosing, and then he rejected their authority openly, declaring that inheritance did not absolve cruelty, and that bloodlines preserved through intimidation were not legacies to be protected, but structures to be dismantled. Emotion stirred beneath his restraint, not as fury but as conviction sharpened by years of discipline, and the effect was unmistakable. This was not rebellion born of impulse, but renunciation chosen with full knowledge of consequence. He named the practice for what it was, tradition weaponized to silence dissent, and refused to sanctify it through obedience. The room reacted unevenly. Some faces hardened, others faltered, and a few, those unused to seeing power questioned aloud, watched with something like dawning recognition. Lord Valewyn attempted interruption, invoking continuity and sacrifice, but the words landed hollow now, exposed as rhetoric stripped of moral authority. Nathaniel did not argue further. He did not plead. He simply concluded by stating that he would no longer lend his name, his presence, or his silence to practices that depended upon fear rather than consent, and that any cost demanded for such refusal would be borne willingly. Maribel felt the weight of the moment settle fully as he finished, not as triumph, but as irreversible shift. She stepped forward then, her voice calm, her posture composed, long hair smooth against her back, and she named what his words had made possible. She stated that House of Valewyn had relied upon silence to extract compliance, and that silence had failed. Her future, she said, would no longer be negotiated through debts, threats, or bloodline claims, and whatever consequences followed would be faced with her voice intact. The statement was not defiance alone. It was declaration. Emotion moved through the space, complex and unsettled, as the assembled witnesses grasped what had occurred. This was not a family dispute contained by walls, but a public severing of authority from inevitability. Nathaniel's choice had stripped the house of its most potent weapon, the assumption that blood demanded obedience, and in doing so, it had altered the balance irrevocably. As Lord Valewyn stood rigid, his certainty fractured beyond repair, Maribel understood with quiet clarity that the most dangerous line had been crossed. Nathaniel had spoken against his own bloodline, not in rejection of heritage, but in defense of conscience, and the act reshaped what power could demand going forward. Whatever followed, retaliation, exile, scrutiny, would unfold in daylight rather than shadow. Silence had lost its dominion, and in its place stood choice, spoken aloud and claimed without apology. Society responded with a speed that revealed how carefully it had been trained to protect its own equilibrium. Invitations rescinded with polite regret, doors closed with expressions of sympathy rather than shame, and Maribel felt the shift almost immediately, the air around her thinning as though space itself were withdrawing permission. Conversations that had once welcomed her presence now ended before she approached. Glances lingered just long enough to mark association before turning away, and the whispers that followed carried neither outrage nor curiosity, so much as discomfort, the unease of those forced to reckon with truths they preferred to keep abstract. She understood the pattern well enough. The woman who disrupted order was not punished loudly. She was removed quietly, allowed to fade beneath the weight of collective disapproval until her absence felt natural rather than engineered. Nathaniel faced a parallel reckoning, his name invoked now with caution rather than respect, alliances fraying not through confrontation but through omission, correspondence unanswered, obligations deferred indefinitely. The cost of his choice revealed itself not in dramatic exile but in gradual erosion, the slow dismantling of access that had once been assumed. Emotion pressed close, anger, regret, fatigue, but he disciplined it into resolve, understanding that the consequences he faced were precisely those that silence had long been designed to prevent. To endure them openly was itself an act of refusal. For Maribel, the isolation cut differently. She felt the instinct to apologize rise dangerously close, the old reflex to smooth tension, to reassure others that she did not intend disruption, and she recognized it for what it was: a learned response to threat, a survival mechanism honed through years of quiet endurance. She resisted it deliberately. Instead of shrinking, she maintained her presence where permitted, appearing in public spaces with composed clarity, her long hair worn simply, her posture unyielding without being confrontational. She would not make herself smaller to ease the discomfort of those who had benefited from her silence. Their bond deepened in this shared narrowing of world, not through declarations but through endurance. They spoke often, not of strategy now, but of fatigue, of the strange grief that accompanied clarity, of how easily systems punished those who named them aloud. Nathaniel did not offer assurances of restoration, nor did Maribel ask for them. What they shared was steadier than promise: recognition, respect, and the knowledge that neither stood alone in consequence. There were moments when doubt surfaced unbidden, when Maribel questioned whether she had misjudged the cost, whether freedom purchased at the price of belonging could truly be called victory. In those moments, she returned to the memory of silence pressing against her upon arrival, the weight of a fate decided without her voice, and the doubt receded. Whatever uncertainty lay ahead was at least hers to navigate. As days passed, the narrative began to shift subtly. Whispers sharpened into questions into quiet acknowledgments that what had been exposed could not be unseen. Not all turned away. A few remained, tentative but present, drawn less by courage than by curiosity, and Maribel recognized in that small persistence the first signs of change. The world had not softened, but it had adjusted, forced to accommodate the disruption she and Nathaniel had introduced. They moved through the altered landscape with steady resolve, neither triumphant nor defeated, understanding that progress rarely announced itself loudly. Silence had lost its power to define them. Even in isolation, they remained visible, aligned, and unashamed, and in that visibility lay the quiet beginnings of a future, shaped not by decree, but by choice. The refuge Nathaniel offered was not framed as retreat but as pause, a place where distance could be used not to disappear, but to breathe. And when Maribel arrived at Blackmere lands, she felt the difference immediately. The estate was quieter, less polished in its authority, its order shaped by stewardship rather than spectacle, and she sensed in its rhythms an absence of the watchful pressure that had governed her every step at Valewyn. Nathaniel did not present the refuge as protection owed or claimed. He made clear, from the first moment, that her presence there would remain her choice, unbound by expectation, unmarked by obligation, and the clarity of that distinction steadied her more than comfort ever could. Days passed with deliberate simplicity. Maribel walked the grounds freely, long hair loose against her back, the motion of it in the open air a small, constant reminder of space reclaimed. She read, she rested, she thought without the need to measure every breath, and in that quiet, the accumulated strain of vigilance began to ease. Nathaniel gave her distance without withdrawal, available without hovering, his restraint shaped by respect rather than caution, and the balance allowed something new to emerge between them, tenderness, unpressured by crisis. They spoke often, but without agenda, sharing observations rather than plans, acknowledging the cost of what had been lost without romanticizing the loss. Maribel found that she could speak here without guarding every word, and Nathaniel listened without attempting to guide the conversation toward outcome. Emotion moved between them gently, not as declaration but as recognition, an affection growing not in defiance of hardship, but in the space left by its passing. For the first time since her arrival at Valewyn, Maribel allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by resistance alone. The uncertainty remained, real and present, yet it no longer eclipsed the possibility of choice. She understood now that sanctuary did not require possession, that safety could exist without silence, and that love, if it came, would do so not as rescue, but as companionship freely chosen. As evening settled over Blackmere, the air calm and unremarkable, Maribel felt a quiet certainty take hold. Whatever storms remained, they would be met not from confinement, but from ground she had stepped onto willingly. The house behind her had been built on control. This one, she realized, was built on consent, and the difference changed everything. The final attempt came without spectacle, delivered through parchment and precedent rather than voice, as House of Valewyn sought to reclaim authority through legal maneuver rather than public decree. Notices arrived with careful formality, citing inherited obligations and contested interpretations meant to exhaust rather than persuade, and Maribel felt the familiar pressure stir, not fear this time, but resolve refined by distance and rest. At Blackmere, the response was measured. Nathaniel assembled counsel and records with the same restraint that had guided every step, laying facts beside testimony, sequence beside assumption, until the pattern revealed itself plainly even to those inclined to doubt. The letter Maribel had kept, the one that offered protection in exchange for silence, was placed where it belonged, not as threat, but as evidence. When Maribel testified, she did so without flourish, her account precise and unembellished, naming the debts, the engineered privacy, the pressure masked as kindness. She spoke as a woman accustomed to being heard at last, not pleading for belief but stating truth. The effect was decisive. Valewyn's claims collapsed under scrutiny, their authority revealed as reliance on momentum rather than right, and the final ruling dismantled the scheme in full. There was no triumph in the room when it ended, only a sober acknowledgement that what had been taken could not be returned to shadow. Afterward, Maribel stepped into the open air with a calm that surprised her. Freedom, she discovered, arrived not as relief alone, but as responsibility accepted. She had kept her voice. The cost had been real, and the future, now unclaimed by others, was finally hers to choose. Freedom did not announce itself with celebration. It arrived quietly, settling into Maribel's life with the steadiness of something earned rather than granted, and she felt its weight most clearly in the absence of pressure, in mornings that asked nothing of her beyond her own choosing. At Blackmere, she moved without permission, spoke without calculation, and allowed silence to exist as rest rather than restraint. Her long hair was often left loose now, not as statement, but as habit, a reflection of how little she needed armor where consent shaped the ground beneath her feet. Nathaniel never hurried what grew between them. He did not claim her future as recompense for risk taken, nor frame loyalty as debt repaid. Instead, he stood beside her in the ordinary hours, walking the land, sharing quiet meals, discussing plans without assumption, and in that constancy, affection deepened into something unmistakable. When he spoke at last of what he felt, it was not as declaration wrested from crisis, but as choice offered freely, without urgency or expectation. Maribel answered with the same calm certainty, meeting him not as one rescued, but as one who had chosen. They did not speak of bloodlines as destiny again. What mattered now was intention, the daily practice of respect, the refusal to trade silence for comfort. Together, they shaped a future defined not by what had been broken, but by what had been rebuilt with care. Maribel's fate had once been decided without her voice. It would never be again.